I'm Sanford Unger, Director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown, and delighted to have a very qualified and distinguished panel together this evening. David Cole, professor at the Georgetown University Law Center for the last 8 years, National Legal Director for the ACLU, and still doing that job as well as teaching law until his replacement arrives. Anamona Hartikolas, an esteemed national reporter for the New York Times, covers higher education and has seen this, what we're talking about on the ground. Justin Hansford, to my left, is the executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law, perhaps the most prolific speaker on free speech in the United States, Nadine Strossen, who was for 17 years national president of the ACLU and a professor at New York Law School. And we're very pleased that Nadine joined us as well. We're going to talk not about issues that people are protesting about, at least not expressly and purposely in that. We're going to talk about the issue of protesting on American campuses and how it can go forward, if it can, in a peaceful, civilized, respectful manner, without physical, emotional damage, without all kinds of trouble of the sort that we saw last season, last semester, and after the events in the Middle East. So obviously some specific topics will come up, but I think it's really time to try to have a national conversation about how we listen to each other, or how we try to listen to each other, instead of trying to shout each other down. David, I thought we might start with you, because you've handled so many different cases of every variety. Is the process of protesting on college and university campuses breaking down from what it was successfully for so many years, or is it okay?
I don't think it's breaking down, I do think it's okay. Look, the protests over the last spring were, some of them were over the top, some of them went over the line, but by and large, it is people coming together, speaking out for something they care about, that they care deeply about. It's a war. People are dying on both sides in that war. People understandably feel very strongly in situations like that, and so will speak passionately. This is a war between a country that is identified with a religion, and a terrorist group that is identified with a religion. And so when people speak passionately about something they care about deeply, they can sometimes cross lines, and I think sometimes that happened. But by and large, I think the rules should be clear. That is, a protest, students are free to protest, should be free to protest. They are free to protest on public universities, and by policy, they're generally free to protest in private universities, because private universities, although not governed by the First Amendment, tend to adopt a kind of free speech policy, as Georgetown has. And in that context, they're free to say hateful things. They're free to say things that, I wouldn't say to you, and I wouldn't want you to say to me in this context, but this is a different context than, out on the green protesting. So in terms of sort of speech, I think, yeah, the constraints are you can't engage in targeted discrimination against an individual or a group of individuals because of who they are. But that's not saying from the river to the sea. That is not, that is not targeted discrimination of any kind. The other issue, though, and I'll stop, is the encampments, right? And encampments, every school is permitted to, and the government is permitted to, and they must have reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on speech. And they can, if they so choose, bar encampments. They can, if they so choose, bar encampments, as long as they do that across the board and they do it neutrally. There's nothing unconstitutional about doing so. Students nonetheless engage in encampment as a form of civil disobedience. When you engage in a form of civil disobedience, you should expect to get punished. That's the whole point. You care enough about what you're doing that you're willing to violate the rules and you're willing to take the consequences. You know, Martin Luther King, he went to prison, you know, for violating the rules, you know, and because the cause was greater. So, you know, I don't think, I think I would not have wanted to be a school administrator this past spring, you know, it has been a tough time for administrators, partly because they have so little power. But I think in terms of the kind of the rules and the understandings, I think we're in a pretty good place.
May I say something about encampments, Sandy? Because I will confess the ACLU did try to argue, we did argue in the Supreme Court that encampments are constitutionally protected. It was a case that preceded your time, David, in 1984. Your predecessor as legal director, Burt Newborn, an NYU law professor, argued it in the Supreme Court. And we were representing a group of homeless people who wanted to camp out on the National Mall in winter specifically to make the point that the homeless shelters were so awful that they were willing to sleep outdoors in these tents. So it was, the encampments were logically connected to their message. And we actually won in the lower court, but in the Supreme Court we got only 2 votes. So I think it is important to note that as a matter of First Amendment law, the justices were pretty strong that even if you have an expressive purpose for encampment, the disruption, the health problems, the traffic problems are enough to justify the restrictions.
Let's stay with the ACLU alumni for a second. Nadine, I want to know if you agree with David that there are some lines that shouldn't be crossed, that there are some often unwritten, sometimes written, and sometimes reasonable rules of how far people can go. As a former educational administrator myself, I worry about the educational and research process that are the essential purposes of universities being disrupted and, in some cases, prevented from taking place by protests.
I'm going to rely on First Amendment principles because, as David rightly said, the vast majority of private institutions voluntarily adhere to those same standards. Under the First Amendment, government, including universities, may impose reasonable, content-neutral, time, place, and manner restrictions which are designed to promote and protect the educational mission of the institution. So any kind of protest that disrupts that mission, for example, by obstructing access to certain classrooms, by being so noisy that the lecturer cannot be heard, by protesting outside a library and therefore in a noisy way and disrupting the peaceful study. But this is simply applying to a university context, Sandy, general First Amendment principles, which is as long as you are not targeting specific messages because of disapproval of the viewpoint. You know, I don't like the idea in From the River to the Sea. That is not a justification for suppressing it. But if that message is shouted at 3 in the morning outside a dormitory, that would violate a content-neutral time, place, and manner restriction.
Well, we'll get to some of this later. Justin, I want to know what you think about this, and especially about some of the hateful messages that emerge in the course of constitutionally permissible protests?
Thank you. I'm definitely anxious to have this discussion. In 2017, you might remember there were a number of, I would say, provocateur-ish, free speech campaigns that were conducted by Milo Yiannopoulos and others. And at that time, there was a great deal of discussion around the need to protect those speakers in the name of free speech, and efforts to stifle that speech on the grounds of it being hate speech as being too woke, the audience being snowflakes. So I start with that to show that as we fast forward to 2024, many of the protesters have this stark contrast in the treatment of the controversial speakers in these two different situations. And the question of content neutrality is one that is always going to be very fiercely questioned, especially with the power imbalances that are very much apparent between those who spoke in 2017 and those who are speaking through encampments in 2024. Now, the questions around whether the rules are stable at this moment, I think it's a very important question. I'm just fascinated about the fact that we have the presidents of Columbia University, Harvard University, who have lost their jobs, not because they necessarily didn't follow constitutional law, but because community standards seem to be so unstable right now. And their stakeholders seem to disagree with the First Amendment standards and/or whether their leadership should go beyond the limits of free speech when it comes to these protests. So to me, that is a crisis. The question is, sure, we know the lines of where the law will respond, but we don't know the lines of where the community stands right now. And if I was the school administrator, I also wouldn't want that job, because you may know where the First Amendment will allow you to go, but where will your board members allow you to go? And where will Congress allow you to go before they call you in for hearings based on your decision around free speech? And that's really in flux at the moment.
Can we ask you to speculate on what Thurgood Marshall would say?
Well, Thurgood Marshall was an avid supporter of free speech and the First Amendment, of course. He was a supporter of Dr. King in the protests, and the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, throughout the 60s actually helped to litigate many of those cases that helped us to determine the parameters of free speech law.
And he was the head of the NAACP.
He was the head of that, that's right.
Legal and Education, I can't remember.
Legal Defense Fund.
Legal Defense Fund.
That's right. And he, so all of these issues involving boycotts and involving, marches and all of these different First Amendment standards that we apply today, many of them were created in response to the civil rights movement's activities in the 1950s and 1960s. And so there was the free speech freedoms that we experience today in large part are part of the heritage of the civil rights movement.
Of course. And Amona, you have covered some of these events, I believe, for the New York Times. And so you've seen them from the ground level, not just the policy conversations. And do you feel that the demonstrations on campus have been accomplishing their purpose? Have they been reasonable? Are they creating fear, danger of property destruction? How would you characterize what you've seen?
Well, I'm not sure that accomplishing their purpose and being dangerous or striking fear are contradictory goals in this case. But I do want to say, by the way, that when I was coming in, there was a demonstration outside.
Yes, there is.
So
right.
I wondered if I should pull out my notebook and start taking notes. And the students who brought me in said, that the demonstration was to protest police presence during demonstration, that Georgetown now has rules that the police should be present. And I think there is a delicate balance to be struck there, and I've seen it over the years, even in kindergarten through 12th grade schools that I once covered, where the question is, should there be metal detectors in schools? And you know, there are different points of view on this, but some people think the very presence of metal detectors creates an atmosphere of threat and is not appropriate in an elementary school or a middle school or a high school even. And maybe the mere presence of police creates a sense of threat and is not appropriate at a college protest. It's arguable.
Well, I just want I know there are other things you probably want to say, but I just want to correct one thing, that my understanding is that they're not protesting the presence of Georgetown University security personnel at their demonstrations, but they're protesting the fact that a rule is being enforced that they must pay a fee to security to be there. Now, I'm informed that this has been going on for a long time, but it's just gotten attention right now. We, the Free Speech Project, when we have public programs which can be expected to be controversial, we always have a security presence, not to control what anyone says or does, but just to make sure everyone's safe. And we have paid a minor fee, as we are this evening, for that presence. I believe that's what the protesters are focusing on this occasion.
So is that a defund the police issue, or is it they just don't want to pay?
No, I don't think it's a defund
They don't want
the police
another
issue.
fee.
I think it's a, well, I don't want to sound like an apologist for anybody, but I think it's a kind of administrative snafu of some sort that these demonstrators may feel they're being singled out, but I honestly don't think they are. I think it's a general rule that is enforced. One can oppose the general rule, I suppose, but there may be reasons why Georgetown University all last year had no encampments, had no violence, no injuries, no police raids, arresting people on campus. If people wanted to be arrested or wanted to be in an encampment, they had to go down to George Washington University downtown, or maybe Howard. Were people arrested at Howard?
No, I think the George Washington encampment encompassed a number of different campuses.
Yeah.
In the
So
area.
we exported our personnel to.
Sandy, if I may say so, as you indicated, the facts are important here.
Yes.
And notwithstanding what happened to the president of Harvard, et cetera, context is determinative, as we know. So to use another cliche, the devil is in the details. If, in fact, the security fees are being enforced in a discriminatory or selective or non-content neutral, non-viewpoint neutral manner, that would be problematic. And now I'll cite another Supreme Court case of the ACLU, which we won, from Forsyth County, Georgia, where the officials were assessing security fees, not irrationally, by the way, in terms of how costly they thought the security would be. And not surprisingly, the more controversial the message, the more controversial the theme of the demonstration, the more predictable that there might be more security needed and therefore more costs. And the Supreme Court said, in effect, that is viewpoint discrimination and it violates the First Amendment.
Well, I don't think that's where we are on this particular demonstration this evening, but it is an interesting thing that to get here this evening, you had to walk through a demonstration, just what we were talking about. But Anna Mona, are you worried about the season ahead? I mean, do you see yourself buying riot gear for yourself to cover demonstrations, or are you worried about the direction this is going?
Well, I wouldn't use the word worried. unless we're talking about the fact that I, will have to leave home and be away from my daughter. And I think the demonstrations will continue. Yeah, I mean the war is not over, and the passions are high, and the students, the pro-Palestinian demonstrators who are calling for divestment have had some success, and a little bit of success will fuel more action. So,
Brown University, for example.
well, a number of universities have agreed to at least talk about divestment. And so once you get that far, they're going to push for more.
So you think that you do not think there's a crisis over this? You don't think it's disrupting the educational mission or the research
I think it
mission?
probably is.
I'm sorry?
I think it may be in certain instances, yes, of course. It's disruptive. And maybe the presidents are correct that some students, I think the presidents are correct that some students feel unsafe, and probably rightly so.
I mean, it is, as Nadine said, the devil's in the details, right? And what happens on Georgetown campus is different what happens at Wesleyan, what happens at Howard. But it is noteworthy that something like, over 100 campuses, there were encampments, and at virtually all of them, eventually, the presidents called for the arrest of the students. That they tried to negotiate in some instances, but by and large, at the end of the day, the students weren't willing to budge in most places, and so they were arrested. I ask, to what end? Right? To what end? And I think this, I think this is a conundrum for a president, right? The president has an obligation to make sure that everyone feels safe and that education goes forward. And there's an encampment that's making lots of noise and getting in the way of people. And even the most free speech university in the country, University of Chicago, ultimately led to, was driven to arrest.
They cleared the encampment.
They cleared the encampment, right? So, and by force, they cleared the encampment, right? But if you're the president of the university, what can you do? You arrest the students. What does that do? It does nothing. You get arrested. If there's a large number of people who get arrested, nothing happens. Most instances, the charges get dismissed. At most, you get community service. It's a badge of honor to be arrested. I mean, my kids were activists in college, and they were arrested, and it was great. That was the whole point. Get arrested. I care about climate change. I'm going to get arrested. Great, right? So that's not a deterrent. Suspending the students or punishing them within the school hierarchy, that might be an option, but not if your faculty is going to overturn you, which is the case in many of these places, and where you don't really have authority, the faculty can override you, and not if they are paying clients. They're your customers, and if it's a large enough group, you can't really take any serious action against a large group either. So I think they're really left without much tools, and I would say, therefore, you should be as tolerant as possible. You ought to be tolerant on First Amendment principles, but you also ought to be tolerant if you recognize that coming in with force is likely to make the situation worse, not better.
Right. Justin.
Yeah, and I just to echo your statement, David, speaking from my experience, and I'm someone who's also arrested while protesting, and I'm very proud about it and can brag about it now. So I see where you're going with that. But the encampments activities that I saw at GW involved a number of educational processes. Political education is what they would call it. There were donations coming in from around the country, so there were 3 meals a day. The encampments for the students had created solidarity with encampments of houseless people. So in many ways, they were providing meals to people who would not otherwise have any meals. So to speak a little bit on the sense of community built at the encampments I think that's important to contextualize for school administrators around the country, because the encampment space itself is certainly not what the educators intended to be as a location of education. But throughout my experiences, and I think all of our experiences with protest speech, there's a really deeply educational component of protest speech. And those experiences that those students have, similar to the experiences that anti-war protesters had in the 1970s and civil rights protesters had in the 1960s, become some of the formative educational experiences of their lives. And so as someone who sees these students as young ones that you want to grow and develop, to me the question is how do you make these moments teachable moments? And I definitely agree that arresting them or even suspending them and punishing them for engaging in this speech is not the best teaching tool. Educating them about the issue in a way that is even-handed and safe, finding ways to educate them about free speech and protest and the history of that activity. Some of these other interventions might actually do more to forward the educational mission than being overly concerned about the raucous nature of the things that are happening at the encampments.
We'll get back to history and a couple of the points in a minute, but I just want to ask you, when you went down to GW, in what capacity were you there?
As a visitor.
As a spectator?
as a person who was happy to see students speaking out. I can say that every time I've visited protests, encampments, whether it's in Ferguson or wherever it may be, I feel a sense of exhilaration because usually these are people who, in my experience, have a deep passion for a political issue. I'm a lawyer who's passionate about civil rights.
At Georgetown University law graduate.
And Georgetown University law graduate. Yep. So very excited to see what they were doing, and I had provided some commentary on what was taking place, and specifically in the context of the media. I think we'll talk about that later, and how the students were being conflated with this question of outside agitation.
Right.
So I was engaged in some analysis as well. But to me, it's always an exhilarating feeling to see the activity take place and to see the students so passionate about public issues, I believe does bode well for the future of our country. And the fact that they're disagreeing is not unforeseen. We're lawyers, and we're used to, and journalists, and we're used to having severely intense disagreements and being able to use that as a platform for reasoning, hopefully, and come to conclusions to disputes. And I believe that these young people will also use this as a platform for knowledge building and reasoning.
I think what I hear Justin saying is he was not an outside agitator.
Right.
I'd like to make a couple points. First, I was also a protester, although I managed not to get arrested, in the 60s and 70s against the Vietnam War and for women's rights and so forth. And I, too, am very happy that we have a new resurgence of campus activism. It started with the Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson after decades when college students were very quiescent, and public opinion polls showed that students weren't even paying attention to or interested in news events, let alone trying to affect the news and shape public policies themselves. So I don't at all take that for granted. That's wonderful. But I want to make another point here, and it ties into something Anna-Mona alluded to, and that is that there are free speech concerns on both sides here. And David, you kind of alluded to it too when you said even the vaunted University of Chicago took down encampments. Because if there are disruptive protests, if there are harassing expressions, if there's hostile environment, pervasive discrimination on the basis of certain identity or belief characteristics, that becomes a deterrent and a bar to other members of the campus community expressing themselves. I mean, at the most basic level, that was the point the Supreme Court made about the encampments. If they're there, you stop other protesters from using that space. But you also are impeding the educational process, which means an imposition on free speech. Columbia University completely canceled all classes because of the disruptive protests, so students were relegated to Zoom, which many of us think is not as effective an educational opportunity. And if you fear that you are going to be subject to harassment or bullying, or worse yet, even a physical assault, which we've seen. We've heard reports of students being held captive in their dormitory and not feeling safe, literally, to go to class or to express their own views.
Well, informally, I would say that I've read enough to indicate that the American public is not so exhilarated by these campus demonstrations, that they don't necessarily see it as a sign of constructive education, what have you. And Anna-Mone, I wanted to ask you about that, whether you think that is in part, as a journalist myself, I hate to ask this question, but is it partly because of the way some of the demonstrators are portrayed? Is it partly, is the threat, not by you, of course, but is the threat potentially exaggerated by other people? Why should the public appear to be turned off by some of this?
I don't exactly know the answer, but there's always a silent majority in these kinds of situations, and I'm sure there's a large silent majority here too, not among only the public outside of universities, but within universities too, and those are the people who are not activists or who think that student protesters are elitist in some way, or they don't identify with their issues. So I think it has to do with that kind of divide.
But you don't think the media have blown the protests out of proportion? Or?
I don't think you're going to get me to criticize the media.
Well, it's hard to get me too, but in this role,
I will criticize some parts of the media. I mean, to me, the really bad actors here are Congress and the Congressional Committee and the right, which has taken on the cause of anti-Semitism, you know, of protecting against anti-Semitism suddenly, because it's a useful way to target elite universities, which they don't like because they see them as more progressive and more liberal.
Although most of them attended those elite
yeah, many of them did, but they didn't like it when they were there, and they certainly wouldn't you know, put it on their resume. So I think, I think that you saw in the hearings, both the first set of hearings, well, all the sets of hearings, you saw members of Congress exaggerating the problem, trying to, browbeat administrators to silence speech, basically because they wanted to attack the institution of the academy. And I think, Fox News is part of that same campaign. So those are the stories that a lot of people are seeing. That's what they're hearing. They're not going to the protests. They're watching Fox News, and they're seeing the members of Congress quoted in their, in their little sound bites. And I think that's been the most destructive force in the whole picture.
These so-called congressional hearings, which did not ask for information at all from the college presidents, succeeded in getting several of them to resign or be pushed to resign, push them over the cliff. And I think some of those members of that committee, who one in particular I can think of, who herself attended one of the universities that was in question, it was as if she had notches in her belt, from how many university presidents resigned.
It was the closest thing to the McCarthy hearings that I've seen in my, lifetime. I mean, it wasn't the McCarthy hearings in terms of the kind of long, the breadth of the attack on a particular ideology, but it was the same thing. It was about loyalty. It was about, will you say that you will, that you will punish someone for saying genocide to the Jews? It's browbeating people to sort of bow down to power, and to bow down to power that is seeking to suppress speech.
But with all, I agree with the critiques of many members of Congress who participated in that inquisition. But I think it doesn't excuse, for example, the former president of Columbia University, who threw faculty members under the bus without any nod toward due process, basically saying that these people would be losing their jobs because of their controversial expression, without a single reference to academic freedom. So, I would say, at least using her as an example, the university was too complicit in that browbeating process.
Well, she was browbeaten. She was browbeaten. I don't know if she's
But
complicit. When you succumb to an attack, it doesn't necessarily make you complicit in the attack. If I walk out the street and someone attacks me and I get beaten, am I complicit in the
Yes,
attack?
you
So
are.
I would
Yes.
object to
Well,
complicity, but I agree.
Yeah.
That
David,
she should.
I know you well enough. I'm sure that if you were in that position, you would have defended the academic freedom of the faculty member, and you would have defended the due process
No
rights.
question. I'm just objecting to the
But the
concept
academic
of
freedom of
complicity.
the faculty members, is that academic freedom to sit there in a quasi-public situation and send each other vulgar texts about the people who were speaking? Or I don't know.
So Sandy's talking about another incident at Columbia University during a public event about anti-Semitism, in which a number of members of the Jewish leaders of the Jewish community at Columbia, including the director of Hillel, were speaking about the suffering of the Jewish students. And I've read the second report on anti-Semitism at Columbia. It is an extremely distressing situation, and I know that there are other kinds of discrimination there too, but several administrators were texting each other with mocking emojis
and vulgar texts
and
about the people who were
and
expressing
anti-Semitic
expressing
memes
their
as
pain.
well. And some clever student behind them photographed that or videotaped it, and that became a basis for them losing their jobs. But they were not faculty members. They were administrators, and therefore not protected in the same way as a faculty member would be.
I understand that, but the distinction would be lost on a lot of people. It's no better or worse that whether they're administrators or faculty members, to sit there and exchange mocking texts is really demeaning and frightening, it seems to me, whatever their rank or position in the university is. And that strikes me as, I don't know if it's a form of hate speech, it's certainly improper behavior.
I don't think it's hate speech. I think it's a lack of professionalism. And you do, at whatever profession you're in, you are held to those standards. But I wouldn't call it hate speech. It was they were sending it to each other. They weren't expressing it towards anyone else. And they were being stupid.
That.
They were being unprofessional. And when that becomes public, then they're unable to do their jobs, and that's why they.
And they don't have a constitutional right to keep those jobs.
Yeah, well, the question of hate speech is something I've thought a lot about, as well as a critical race theorist. And there was a period in time when campus hate speech codes were hotly in debate, and they were litigated on the constitutional level and the Supreme Court level. And I'd love to talk about that history, because during that time, of course, most of the hate speech was anti-black hate speech.
Of course.
So the discussion and the discourse at that time, just going back to David's point, some of the same people who today in Congress are so outraged about the hate speech that's taking place, those exact same individuals during that time would say the answer to hate speech is more speech. And there was a time period where there was I want to say an agreement, but there was a broad consensus that we would have to respond to hate speech with more speech across the political landscape. And that broad consensus has shifted in the last year in a way that has been amazing to me. And I'm adamantly in support of the suppression of hate speech. In fact, some of my scholarly role models, Mari Matsuda, Charles Lawrence, wrote a book about the negative impact of hate speech on a psychological level and also on a physical level that had been gone to such an extent that they proposed even a tort claim or a criminal claim as possible responses to hate speech in the 90s. So that discourse was one that, again, it was shut down at the time, but the change in the political landscape, and to be honest, who is now being seen as a victim of hate speech, did change the politics. And I still have the same stance against hate speech.
Right.
But I have to note that, and I think many people in the communities that we work with will note that hate speech is being seen as much more of a problem now that the people who are victimized by it are different. And that itself is a statement about where we are in our society.
Well, I think this is a very important intellectual point because many of the people often, I don't want to overstate this, who defend hate speech have never been the victims of hate speech. And it's all an academic, a theoretical point for them. Many of the victims, I'm not saying all of them. And I think it is unreasonable, if I may insert my own my own view about this, I think it's unreasonable to expect some people to listen to that hate speech, to be calm in the face of that hate speech, because it's demeaning, and it deprives people of self-esteem and questions their humanity. And I don't think that as a culture and as a civil liberties community, we've figured out how to handle that aspect of it.
I think the answer is still the one that you rightly said had been the consensus and politically, and certainly is the law. And interestingly enough, this is a point where the Supreme Court from the 1960s on, certainly including Thurgood Marshall, have been unanimous without a single dissenter, despite all of the differences among the justices on other issues, that the answer to speech that you hate or that's hateful is not government suppression, except in certain specific contexts, if it's intentional incitement of imminent violence, or if it's a true threat, or if it's targeted bullying or harassment, or if it's evidence of a hate crime. There are many contexts in which it may be punished, but solely because of its hateful message, the response is whatever you consider to be strategic. Maybe it's ignoring it, not giving the hate mongers the attention that they're seeking. Often that's what they want. They court suppression because then they get attention from the media that they otherwise would not. Or maybe it's to refute them. Maybe it's to support the people who are the targets of their hateful expression. And I would say, not only as a civil libertarian, but as an educator, that those are more effective responses. We're trying to change people's attitudes. And I think, treating them as criminals or punishing them is not an effective way to educate them.
So I would just add that, and you won't be surprised to hear that the two ACLU folks here are defending hate speech, but the ACLU's biggest hate speech case right now is a case called Purnell versus Lamb. It's a challenge that we filed in Florida to Governor DeSantis's bill, which prohibits schools, including universities, from expressing certain hateful racial stereotypes, that you are guilty because of your race, that you are, that you deserve a benefit or a demerit because of your race, et cetera, et cetera. And they've identified 8 concepts which are prohibited. And what are they thinking of when they basically say this is racist hate speech. What is it? It's critical race studies. That's what they're targeting. So I think the danger with the kind of, of course hate speech causes tremendous harm. But the danger is who's going to be enforcing it? Who's going to be, is it going to be our friends enforcing it in a positive way, or is it going to be our enemies enforcing it in ways that are very troubling? And I think, the history suggests it's the latter.
One short thing I'll add in, just to keep that thought going. One of the analyses and critiques of the current landscape around hate speech regulation is that commitment to content neutrality, which does not create space for understanding underlying power dynamics. And there are precedents for other types of legal engagements and legal questions where we do care about whether or not the party that is being suppressed is the party that has more access to speech. And that's some of the underlying basis for our regulation around the press, and some like New York Times versus Sullivan and other cases that have tried to create a understanding that when there is more access to public speech platforms, there's more responsibility, more access, more power. A larger voice creates more responsibility. And so I just look at that as we're dealing with these critical race theory, quote unquote, hate speech cases, where the speakers are those who historically have been the ones with less access and less power, who are now being seen as the ones who are the hate speakers, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I just
flipping
have
that on its head.
to say I don't understand why it's considered so radical to consider power dynamics. I mean, that's history, it's sociology, it's journalism, it's facts, and I don't get this notion that it's radical to point out certain things and not others. We'd be happy to take some questions from the audience. John has a microphone here. Will you tell us who you are and what your connection is to the university, if any?
Name is Dave Onspach, member of community.
Okay.
So, did any of you detect any bias? I heard about cases in Florida and Texas where the protests on the campus relating to the conflict in the Near East there. Did they show any bias towards demonstrators that were considered, quote, anti-Semitic, unquote, versus demonstrators that were pro-Israel? Or, did you feel they enforced the laws equitably in Texas and Florida on the protests there? Or they show bias against the pro-Palestinian protests over the pro-Israeli side? Thanks.
Anna-Mona, do you have any evidence of this?
So who would be expressing the
You
bias?
need to use the microphone.
Sorry, who would be expressing the bias? I missed that part. The government? University.
Do you feel like the governments of Texas and Florida showed bias in punishing the protests, like University of Texas, Austin, or protests in Florida, that kind of thing?
Public universities.
Yes, exactly.
Or is there a bias as between the Israelis?
I think they've been they've been very careful not to do that, so that there are reports about anti-Semitism on campus and reports about about Islamophobia, and there's been a kind of an effort to balance those investigations.
Hi, my voice is kind of dying. I'm Leandro, I'm a freshman from the college, and my question is going to be kind of low, so forgive me. Okay, so
Can
it
you
was
move the
this...
microphone a little closer?
Yes, now it's better. Perfect. So we were discussing about the right thing to do, even at the cost of your own personal benefit. And probably there's a sense of responsibility from, for example, the president of Columbia with their students that probably they should have done this, even if it goes to the cost of their own personal benefit. But that's not the case in most students, right? They're doing what they consider moral. They don't have a responsibility to Palestinians, but they are still willing to do this. But if they're doing it because of morals, then should we go, or should they allow these harmful or these harms to their personal benefits? Because it's not for only just going and doing community service for lots of the populations. Like, for example, me as an international student, I can get deported. Literally, in the page that they gave us before coming here, they say, if you can go a protest, you can be arrested, and the government is going to take out your status. That's directly saying, do not protest because you're going to be expelled. Or what about minorities, especially intersectional minorities that fear police brutality because of what happened in 2020? And even if it doesn't happen now, they fear that it's going to happen again. Or low-income students, which Georgetown or any elite school is the opportunity of change generations of suffering, that they want to protest, but they can get expelled, and they are not going to have the same mechanisms as a legacy student to maintain itself in the university. How can we protect these students that have been differentiated and are not in the same position of power to avoid all of these harms that can come from protesting?
David, you?
So fair enough. I think nobody up here is saying people should be arrested. What I said at the outset, though, was that when the school and I, as I said, I don't think it really is a very tactical thing to arrest people. But when people violate clear content-neutral rules that are designed to ensure safety and et cetera, and they're not willing to stop, what is the school supposed to do? I mean, you, at some point, and that's why I think when you look across the country, over 100 campuses had protests, and virtually all of them cleared the encampment, and maybe 5 to 10 at most did it successfully through negotiations with the students, in which the students said, "Okay, we will walk away if you agree to let us speak to your board." You know, Brown did that. A couple other schools did that. Those students got condemned by many of their compatriots across the country for doing that, because they willingly closed down the encampment. So I do think I hear you that for some people, getting arrested is actually more problematic than it is for many of the students. I don't think arrest I think it's the last resort. But at the end of the day, what are you going to do if, in fact, there is some conduct that is going on that violates the rules and violates other people's rights? You have to do something.
Anyone else?
Well, I just want to also acknowledge how high the stakes are for these students. And maybe I'm, being a bit high-minded here, but I do believe that all of these students are acting on moral grounds. I think many of the students deplore anti-Semitism and deplore Islamophobia, and when they are in the heat of the passionate protests, there are lines that are crossed. I do believe there are lines that can be crossed on both sides there. But I think that if I was an administrator, I would look at these young people, sometimes 17, 18, 19 years old, as what they are, which in some cases are kids who need to be, for lack of a better term, parented in a sense, and not criminalized. And it speaks to a broader issue in our society around the criminalization of conduct, which the university, we would hope, could be an oasis against. When these are our students, these are our Hoyas here on Georgetown's campus. I say that as an alumnus. So in this context, we should extend more grace with the understanding that when those lines are crossed, it's not simply a bad act that deserves a slap on the wrist when another Hoya is emotionally harmed. There should be a reconciliation process between our students. There should be a bringing together of our students to be able to have conversations. And I understand that that's not going to solve everything. So these are problems that have been going on for generations. You're not going to solve it with one get-together. But I do think that we should try to extend as much grace as possible to our students.
You know, one of the things that I've observed, I think that's true. One of the things I've observed, though, is that about these demonstrations, and sometimes environmental ones as well, is that there's not a lot of conversation about the demonstrations. It is as if there's an assumption that if you shout louder, have more people, and do it for longer, and make yourself more of a nuisance, the other side will give in. It's just a matter of when it's going to happen, instead of having real conversation. I think the success at Georgetown last year, thanks to a number of key people who worked on this, was that this university kept it from crossing that particular line. The university kept encouraging dialogue. But if people go into this thinking, well, if I just keep doing this long enough and obnoxiously enough, we'll win, it's not how change is achieved.
And it's also not consistent with the educational mission of the university.
Exactly.
I was thinking about that because, unfortunately, we do often have warring groups of students shouting conclusory slogans at each other,
What
which
good
is
does it
the
do?
antithesis of a reasoned discourse. Abu Patel, who's the founder of Interfaith America, Muslim, wonderful advocate of free speech, religious freedom, he said his son is applying to college, and he said, you know, we're not going to pay your $100,000 or whatever it is tuition for you to go to a school where this is what passes for dialogue, because you could do that for free on a public park.
But I don't think anybody expects protests to be reasoned dialogue. It's just a different, and I think, you know, if protest had to be reasoned dialogue to be protected by either a university or by the Constitution, you know, that would not be something we would be happy with. There's a long history of protest with people, you know, repeating slogans over and over and over again, louder and louder and louder, that make a difference, that make a change. So yes, it's not reasoned dialogue, but it's an alternative way for people to express their passions. In the university setting, you do have to, you know, you have to balance that, which I think is generally a good thing, against intrusion and interference with other sorts of rights and interests. But you know, I think if anything, it feels like many institutions concerned about pressure, either from Congress or from their donors, came down too hard, too quickly on too many kids. And in fact, if they had just tolerated and allowed it to go on, it might have died out, you know, when exams came and people actually had to get grades. And
That's the old cure, but it didn't work this time.
well, I don't know that it didn't work. I mean,
Because it wasn't tried, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another question.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Archit Mehta. I'm a journalist from India, and I study at Communication, Culture, and Technology. I'm a second-year grad student. I noticed one of the panelists mentioned that you will not get me to criticize the media. As a journalist, a part of my job also involves to kind of do watchdog journalism, see how media is reporting, especially in India, where hate speech is rampant, and the United States has recognized that. So my question to the said individual is that when organizations like BBC report on the ongoing occupation by Russia in Ukraine, they identify the aggressors. But that is not the case when we see an ongoing genocide in Palestine. So why is that the case? Is it because USA is Israel's ally? Why is that the case? Isn't that unprofessional? Thank you.
When do they not identify the aggressor? Sure, it is important to criticize the media, and I was being a bit flippant, but absolutely. Yeah.
I was also going, so on that same point, I'm happy to criticize the media as well. One of the things that I was most concerned about was the narrative of outside agitators being complicit or being responsible even for the protests on American campuses. And what that reminded me of was the ongoing history of this outside agitator character, going back to the civil rights movement, where the accusation was that the civil rights protesters were being agitated by communist outside agitators, through the Black Lives Matter movement, where it was supposed to be George Soros, to now, where you create these villains that are always more sophisticated, villains who have money, villains who are demonized, who then allow for you to plant the seeds for a harsh repression of those protesters on the grounds that you're now looking at this as the outside agitator that's being repressed, not the 18 or 19-year-old freshman who is facing the arrest, but the agitator. So these narratives that are trafficked in the media do play a role in setting the stage for different types of responses, both by campus leadership and by policing organizations. We've seen that happen throughout history. And my perspective has always been, when you see these dynamics, who is speaking out against the status quo? And in these protests and in past protests, in many cases, mainstream media's narrative is the status quo narrative. So when you see the mainstream media narrative, part of my thinking is that, well, who is dissenting from that? Those are dissenters. So the mainstream media's narrative is the ground setting for who is dissenting, just like the government policy is the ground setting for who is dissenting from government policy. So if you're trying to figure out who's who in these debates, oftentimes the media can give you a clue, and your criticism of the media can help you to understand who the players are, in my view.
But I think mainstream media is not as monolithic as you make it sound.
It's very diverse as well. There's diversity in media outlets for sure, now more than ever, I think, with the internet. So certainly there are diverse voices out there. I myself consume Democracy Now! I'll admit that. But to me, when I look at the CNNs, the MSNBCs even, and even going to Fox News, when on this particular debate, there was, I don't want to say a monolithic view of what took place, but certainly there was a distance between some of the things that people saw on social media and in the Democracy Now! Parts of the media and the mainstream. And that, to me, that echoed during the Black Lives Matter period, especially the first few incidents with Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin, where many protesters got their news from social media, and there was a stark difference between the way the protests were represented on Twitter as opposed to the way they were represented in the media. And even there was a difference between some of the victims, Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, up to George Floyd, the way they were represented as, African-American males in mainstream media. I remember the New York Times said Mike Brown was no angel, and I was very sensitive to that as someone who lived in St. Louis, and full disclosure, represented Mike Brown's mother, right, as an attorney, so I was biased on that. But that those types of discrepancies between social media and mainstream media, those fuel the motivations, I believe, of the young people and the students who get more of their information from social media nowadays than from what I would call mainstream media outlets. So there's certainly more options than ever before, but I still believe that you can see patterns, and there were patterns that were observed.
I don't want to get too distracted by this, but I do think that Twitter is a valuable source of information as we journalists follow it closely. It's on the ground information, but it's also can be very distorted information. It lacks context, it's often selective. People on Twitter don't have the resources that a major news organization has to actually dig deeply on a story. So I guess I'm a defender of the mainstream media.
That's all right.
Thank you all.
John?
I am Samuel Breslow. I work as a journalist. My question, one of the biggest distinctions between this current generation of student activism that we're seeing and my own generation back in the 2010s is the widespread use of masks and anonymity among protesters. And there are obvious roots in that in both social media trends and the pandemic. The question for panelists, I'm wondering to what extent are demands that protesters identify themselves reasonable time and place restrictions for colleges to have, and any other thoughts that you have on the use of anonymity in protests?
I think this is a very difficult issue. I'd love to hear what David, among others, thinks about it. The ACLU, now I'm going to give you another example of a case that we lost in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, I don't know, about 20 years ago, was challenging New York's state ban on masks. And the clients in that case were the KKK, but we cited in our, and fortunately, I mean, what's fortunate about that is that they are so unpopular that they required anonymity, right? If they were to protest. The defense of anonymity as an implicit First Amendment right is that if you're trying to express a controversial point of view, you're not going to do it if you have to identify yourself. So it ends up becoming suppressive of minority viewpoints. The ACLU pointed out in that case that we had initially successfully made that argument in the US Supreme Court in a very different part of the country with a very different political climate at the time in the 1950s in Alabama when we defended the right of anonymity for members of the NAACP, because that was the organization that was controversial, where the Supreme Court agreed with us that if you had to reveal your identity, you were unlikely to express your viewpoint. Now, certainly if the purpose for concealment is to make it difficult for government to investigate and prosecute criminal activity, that should not be shielded. But if your purpose for masking is to express a controversial point of view and to seek not to be punished for that, I think that is justifiable.
Yeah, and hard to draw the distinction. I mean, imagine if it was established that you had a right, and this is speaking in my personal capacity rather than my ACLU capacity, that you had a right to wear a mask while in demonstrations. What would have happened on January 6th? You know, the people who engaged in an attempted insurrection at the Capitol have been, many of them, most of them, I think, have been brought to justice, held accountable for what they did because they didn't wear masks. But the next time around, they'll wear masks. So I do think there's a strong interest in not allowing people to wear masks in ways that allow them to violate legitimate rules, like you can't break into the Capitol and seek to oppose the peaceful transition of power, for example.
I'm just going to suggest there are a few people in the back, students who had questions. If we could just get a series of questions and then have one round of answers from the panelists to all those questions. So brief questions, please. Kayla.
Hi, I'm a freshman. I'm interested in your previous point about outside agitators in regard to protests, seeing as though the White House and the Pentagon have both warned against Iranian and or foreign influence on the protests this past spring. Is that in trend with what you were talking about, influence or like outside agitators influencing protests, or is that a separate issue that we should be worried about?
There's somebody in the back there. Oh, two, at least.
I'll make mine short. It actually relates to that one, and I want to just know to what extent should free speech be suppressed for national security?
Yeah, my question was also somewhat related because we've kind of touched on outside agitators quite a bit. And on the one hand, they can seem quite dangerous and very inflammatory for a lot of protests. But on the other hand, it was mentioned that they can build a sort of community with outside actors. And some universities, the University of Chicago, among them, view their engagement with the outside community as a core part of their identity. So I wondered if there was a framework or an idea of how universities should go about introducing outside actors and allowing them to interact with students versus just perhaps maybe correctly shutting down any protest that includes outside voices because they are not a part of their community. Thank you.
Okay, one last one.
Thanks so much. Yeah, my question kind of goes back to the protest as a kind of implicit education. I noticed that in some cases, the protesters may either lack experience or knowledge, and their reasoning of how to organize protests may be more intuitive than based on grounded theories or experience. I wonder if schools can have more education on how contentious politics work by either giving courses or giving some more general knowledge on the framing, mobilization, those kind of stuff, the sociological aspects, rather than just stating the rules. Would that make the situation more, I guess, constructive and helpful rather than just being really hostile?
Okay, so I guess we just ask everybody to comment on whichever of those you like. I have one of my own, just one last one, which is, should university and college administrators be more cautious about taking positions on political and international issues than they have been? I think their goals have been noble, but the results have often been catastrophic.
I think there's a very strong consensus around that position at this time among universities across the board. Like, why create trouble for ourselves by making comments on things that don't affect our students and our institutions and our role? And so I think we're seeing a move towards institutional neutrality. There are arguments on the other side. If civil universities are a big part of civil society, they're an important part of civil society. The reason that the Republicans don't like the academy is because it's an important part of civil society that doesn't agree with them, and so you don't really want to muzzle yourself. But I do think speaking when matters affect your institution, right, that's one thing. Sort of reaching out and speaking on matters of the world, it becomes very difficult to justify why you spoke on this country's problem and not this country's problem and this town's problem, and et cetera.
David, any comment on the other questions that were posed?
I think, I agree with Justin that the outside agitator trope is a very problematic trope. I also think there are actually sometimes outside agitators, as we have seen in our elections with foreign governments seeking to, sow dissension in our country, using our free speech, using our media, and that's a serious problem. So I think you could have an entire, I think, Sandy, you should have an entire panel on outside agitator, what that means, when it's when is it appropriate to target them, when is it not, because it's a very complicated question.
I'll collaborate with you on that next semester, David. Anna-Mona, do you have any?
Well, I was thinking about institutional neutrality, and it's a tricky issue because it's what got Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, into trouble. She was perceived as having had a moral failure to respond to these pro-Palestinian students, and I don't know that a policy of institutional neutrality may have given her cover, but would it have solved the problem? I don't know.
Well, I mean, it has to be consistently enforced. Now, at some point, universities, if they have not followed it in the past, have to make a transition, and a couple of them have. They say, you know, in the past, we have spoken out on other issues. We've decided for various reasons, including reasons of free speech, which I want to say something about, that moving forward, we are not going to make public pronouncements about issues that do not directly affect the university itself. This should not be seen as reflecting on a particular issue. It's a difficult transition, and we'll see whether they adhere to it. But at the initial or most famous embodiment, and I think it was the earliest one, of a policy of institutional neutrality was the famous Calvin report from the University of Chicago in 1967, coming out of the Vietnam era. That is what drove it. Harry Calvin was a leading expert and advocate on freedom of speech. And a major rationale, I would say the major rationale, was to foster the fullest flourishing of diverse opinions and expressions on the part of individual members of the university community, the faculty and the students. The fear being that if an institution as such, through its president or through its dean or department chairs, purports to say what university orthodoxy is on a particular controverted issue, that becomes a deterrent or chilling effect on individual members of the community who should be the ones who are the freest to explore and express their own perspectives. I have to say something about the national security issue, which I thought you would want to also, Sandy, because that was the Pentagon Papers case and the great book that you wrote about that. Over and over and over again, including in the Pentagon Papers case, assertions of national security justifications for restricting speech or enjoining speech have been proven with hindsight, and sometimes at the time, to have been inflated and exaggerated at best, sometimes fabricated at worst. And certainly, if it really were necessary to restrict speech in order to promote national security, the U.S. Supreme Court would say, that's fine, right? That is a legitimate restriction under the First Amendment. But you have to examine the evidence to make sure that there actually is a danger to national security, that restricting the speech is going to actually materially improve that situation, and that there's no less speech restrictive alternative for accomplishing, for protecting national security. These are arguments that are being made, by the way, in the current TikTok case.
Here. And just to follow up once again, when I speak about the history of the outside agitator trope, that did in fact gesture to foreign influence. So Dr. King's quote unquote foreign communist influence was supposed to be the Soviet Union. So the outside agitator trope was really always seen as a foreign interference into a community that seemed to be speaking out of moral impetus, but in reality, as the trope goes, was being manipulated by foreign powers. But another element of that trope is the assumption of the lack of sophistication of those who are in the position of dissent, that they can be easily manipulated and that they have to be protected from that interaction with these other groups, or else they can be easily directed against their will. And I do think that with students, in terms of on campus, certainly there is a similar type of possibility of, I would use the term paternalistic view, that they should not have certain types of interactions with folks outside of the campus. We should protect them from that, and those interactions will poison their understanding, as opposed to saying that this is a global community and these students might want to have broad interactions and still make their own decisions. And I'm sort of on the far end of promoting that type of speech and interaction. And so I really, at the end of the day, am against the outside agitator trope, because also what you're doing is, by using that trope, you are deciding the limits of who's credible and who is part of their community. As you said, many of the individuals who were in dissent, on purpose, they decided to invite people from outside of the campus into their community. So to say to them that those are outsiders to you is wrong, because you're determining for them who they should consider to be outsiders. Maybe to them, this other group, even though they come from another country, they are not outsiders to them. And I think that's really one of the premises of these protests, is that we have a common humanity with people, even in a different country, even under a different flag. We are one with these people. They are not outsiders to us. We are together with them.
Thank you all. Justin, Nadine, Anamona, and David, thank you. We're beyond our promised time limit here. I want to thank you all. I want to thank those who watched us on C-SPAN and those who gathered here at Georgetown University for this timely discussion. Thank you.